My daughter told me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving dinner. She said it with a smile, the kind of smile you give a stranger who's standing too close in line at the grocery store. Polite. Distant. Final. I stood on her front porch with a pecan pie I'd driven 40 minutes to buy from the same bakery she'd loved since she was 9 years old, and she said, "Dad, this year we just want it to be us." I nodded. I told her I understood. I walked back to my truck, set the pie on the passenger seat, and drove home. 2 days later, I had 43 missed calls on my phone. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a cruel man. I have never been a cruel man. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer in Charlotte, North Carolina. I coached Little League for 8 years. I taught my daughter to drive a stick shift in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday morning, and I laughed every time she stalled the engine, which was a lot. I loved that girl with everything I had, and I still do. That has never changed, not even through all of what happened. But love does not mean unlimited tolerance. And at 63 years old, standing alone in my kitchen with a whole pecan pie and nowhere to take it, I finally understood that I had spent years confusing the two. My daughter's name is Serena. She's 31 now. She married a man named Tate about 4 years ago, and from the very first time I shook his hand, I felt something I couldn't name. Not dislike exactly. More like the feeling you get when you're reading a contract and something in the language is slightly off, but you can't find the exact clause that's bothering you. Tate had a way of speaking that was always just barely too confident. The kind of man who finishes your sentences for you, not because he knows you well, but because he thinks his version is better. He sold something in tech. I could never quite keep track of what, and he dressed like he was always about to walk into a meeting, even on weekends. Even at a backyard cookout. My wife, Marlene, passed away 6 years ago. Breast cancer. It was fast, which people tell you is a blessing, and maybe it is, but fast still means you watch someone disappear and there's nothing you can do but hold their hand and keep showing up. After she was gone, Serena and I got closer for a while. We'd have Sunday dinners at my place, just the two of us, and she'd bring wine and I'd make her mother's pot roast recipe that I'd been slowly perfecting, and we'd sit at the kitchen table for 3 hours sometimes just talking. Then she met Tate. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It was gradual, the way water finds its way through concrete. Sunday dinners became every other Sunday, then once a month, then just holidays. Phone calls got shorter. She started referring to my opinions as old-fashioned in a tone that wasn't quite joking. Tate began appearing in our conversations as a kind of invisible authority. Tate thinks, Tate says, Tate and I have decided. I told myself this was normal. She was building her life. I was supposed to step back. What I didn't fully understand yet was that stepping back and being pushed out are two very different things. About 2 years into their marriage, Serena called me and said they were having trouble with their mortgage. Tate's company had gone through a rough quarter. He explained it to me once using a lot of language that didn't quite add up, and they were a few months behind. She asked if I could help. I want to say I thought about it carefully. I did think about it. But the truth is, when your child calls you and says she needs help, a switch flips inside you that bypasses reason entirely. I wrote a check for $18,000 that same afternoon. They got current on the mortgage. A few months later, Tate's new venture was apparently doing better. They bought a new SUV. Serena started getting her hair done at a salon in a part of town I'd never heard of, and when I mentioned it once, gently, just once, she told me that I didn't understand what it was like to try to maintain a certain image when you were building a career. I let it go. About 8 months after the first check, there was a second call. Different problem, same pattern. This time it was credit card debt, $23,000 spread across 4 cards. Serena cried on the phone. She said Tate was under so much pressure and she didn't want to add to his stress by letting him know how bad it had gotten. I asked her why she was carrying debt he didn't know about. She said I didn't understand how their relationship worked. I wrote another check. The third time, it was a business investment Tate wanted to make. He wanted to come talk to me about it in person, which I thought was a good sign. A sign of respect. He sat at my kitchen table with a folder and a presentation on his laptop, and he talked for 45 minutes about a real estate opportunity in a developing area outside of Raleigh. He was polished. He was convincing. He used the word conservative 17 times in 45 minutes, I counted, because I am an engineer, and I notice patterns. I gave them $35,000. The investment did not perform as projected. Tate explained it was market timing. He explained it twice, actually, at two separate dinners, in almost identical language both times. By this point, I had given my daughter and her husband just over $76,000 in 3 years. I had not kept this for myself. I had a spreadsheet, because again, engineer. But I had kept it from people in my life, from my brother, from my old friend Curtis, who'd been telling me for 2 years that something felt off. I kept it for myself in the way that matters most, which is that I had not yet admitted what it meant. What it meant was that I had become a resource, not a father. A resource. I noticed other things during those years, smaller things that I filed away and didn't examine too closely. The way Tate would talk over me at dinner, not rudely, just consistently, always steering conversations back to himself. The way Serena stopped asking about my life, my garden, my health, my old colleagues, and mostly called when she needed to process something about her own. The way holiday visits started coming with conditions. We can come for Christmas, but we can't stay more than a few hours. Or, Thanksgiving works, but Tate's parents are in town, so it'll be quick. Tate's parents, by the way, had a very different relationship with him than I had with Serena. His mother called him 3 times a day. His father had given them a car. His parents came for a 2-week visit every spring and stayed in the guest bedroom that used to be the room where Serena and I would spread out puzzles on rainy days when she was small. I am not a man who is easily made to feel small, but there were moments sitting at my own daughter's dinner table while Tate dominated the conversation and his mother laughed too loudly at everything he said, when I felt like a piece of furniture that had been kept because throwing it out would be inconvenient. Then came the Thanksgiving I told you about. I had called in early October to ask about the holiday. I didn't want to assume. I had learned not to assume. Serena said she'd let me know. 3 weeks passed. I called again. She said they were still figuring it out. 2 more weeks. I sent a text asking if I should plan to bring something. She called me back. That's when she told me they wanted it to be just them this year. Her and Tate and his parents, who were apparently coming down from Maryland. I asked her very quietly if his parents were considered just them, and I was not. There was a pause. She said I was being unfair. I told her I was asking a factual question. She said I was making it into something it wasn't. I drove to the bakery and bought the pie anyway. I don't know why. Force of habit maybe, or some stubborn piece of me that hadn't caught up yet to what was actually happening. I knocked on her door and handed her the pie, and she smiled that stranger's smile, and I drove home. I sat in my kitchen for a long time that night. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying 6 years ago when I lost Marlene, and something about going through that kind of grief changes your relationship with the smaller griefs that come later. You recognize them faster, you don't dress them up. What I felt was clarity. I had been operating under an assumption that had never been tested, which is that the money I gave them came with an implicit understanding, not of repayment. I never wanted repayment, but of basic reciprocity, of being treated like a person who mattered. I had believed that generosity earned belonging, and sitting in that kitchen on the night before Thanksgiving, I understood that I had been wrong about that, and that I had been wrong about it for a long time. The next morning, while Serena was presumably setting her table for people who were not me, I called my attorney. His name is Paul, and I've worked with him for 20 years, since the days when I was running my own small engineering firm and needed someone to review contracts. Paul is methodical and unflappable, and he has seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by almost anything. I told him what I wanted to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure? Not to talk me out of it." Paul has never been the kind of lawyer who second-guesses decisions. He asked because he wanted to make sure I'd thought it through. I told him I'd been thinking about it for longer than I'd realized. We talked for almost 2 hours. Paul had already been updating my estate documents. Marlene and I had done our wills and trusts together, and after she passed, I'd let things drift, which Paul had been gently nudging me about for years. This was in some ways overdue. I removed Serena and Tate from my revocable trust. Not from my will entirely. I'm not a man who acts from spite, but from the trust that held the majority of my assets, including the house. I restructured things so that any future inheritance would come through a separate vehicle with specific conditions that Paul drafted carefully and that I reviewed line by line. There was nothing punitive in the language. It was just honest. It reflected the reality of our relationship rather than the one I had been pretending existed. Then I called the bank. For the past year and a half, I had been co-signed on a personal line of credit that Serena had taken out. I'd agreed to it when Tate's company was having problems, to help them get a better rate. I arranged to have my name removed from that account. It was within my rights. My attorney had confirmed that months ago when I'd first started thinking about this. I also wrote a letter. Not a legal document, just a letter, handwritten on the good stationery Marlene had always kept in the third drawer of her writing desk. I told Serena that I loved her. I told her that I had been trying to buy my way into belonging in her life, and that I understood now that wasn't her fault. I had enabled that dynamic as much as anyone. I told her that I was not disappearing. I was not punishing her. I was simply no longer going to participate in a relationship that was entirely one-directional. If she wanted to rebuild something real, I would be here. My door, as always, was open. I sealed the letter and mailed it on a Friday. By Sunday, Tate had noticed the changes to the credit line. I know this because of what happened next. I was in the garage on Sunday afternoon, replacing a belt on my riding mower, when my phone started ringing. It was Serena. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I let that one go too. A few minutes later, a text. "Dad, I need to talk to you right now." I finished the belt. I washed my hands. I made myself a cup of coffee. Then, I sat down and looked at my call log. I had 43 missed calls and 19 text messages. Some were from Serena. Some, I noticed with a certain weariness, were from a number I didn't recognize until I checked and confirmed it was Tate. One was from his mother, which I had not expected, and which told me quite a bit. I called Serena back that evening. She was upset in the way that people are upset when a situation has not gone the way they planned. It was not grief, exactly. It was more like frustration and an unexpected variable. She said I had blindsided her. She said I had done this out of spite because of Thanksgiving. She said Tate was furious. I told her very calmly that Tate's feelings about my financial decisions were not something I was available to manage. She said I was being cruel. I told her I had mailed her a letter and I would prefer to have any real conversation after she'd had a chance to read it. She said a lot of other things after that. Some of them were hard to hear, not because they were true, but because they came from someone I had spent my life protecting. I stayed quiet. I let her say what she needed to say. When she was finished, I told her again that I loved her and that I hoped she would read the letter. The calls and texts continued for about 4 days. Then they stopped. I got a call from my brother during that time. Paul had reached out to him, not about the details, but just to let someone know I might need checking on. My brother drove over and we sat on the back porch for a couple of hours, not talking about much, which was exactly what I needed. He's that kind of man. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. I know this because Serena called me on Thursday morning. She didn't sound like she had on Sunday. She sounded tired and younger somehow, and uncertain in the way I hadn't heard since she was maybe 16. She said she'd read it 3 times. She asked me if I had really felt that way for that long, like furniture, like something kept around out of inconvenience. I told her yes. She was quiet for a very long moment, and then she said something that I will probably carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "I didn't know I was doing that. I don't think I let myself know." That is the thing about the people we love. When they finally tell the truth, not the defensive truth, not the explaining truth, but the real one. It changes the whole shape of things. We talked for 2 hours that morning, not about money, not about Tate, though he was present in the conversation as a subject neither of us quite named directly. We talked about her mother, we talked about the Sunday dinners. She cried once briefly, and apologized, and I told her there was nothing to apologize to me for, which wasn't entirely accurate, but which was what she needed to hear in that moment. The months that followed were not simple. They rarely are when the ground shifts under a relationship. Serena and Tate did not immediately transform into different people. There were still moments of distance, still conversations where I could hear his framing in her words, but there were also Sunday dinners again. Not every week, but some weeks. She started asking about my garden again. Once, in the spring, she showed up with a bottle of wine and no particular reason, just because she was in the neighborhood, which she had never done before. Tate and I remain what I would describe as politely distant. We are not enemies. I don't wish him harm. But I no longer operate under the illusion that he regards me as anything more than a complicated variable in a life he has organized largely around his own ambitions. That is fine. I have made peace with it. Not everyone in your life has to love you. Some people just have to leave you alone. What I want to tell you, the thing I came here to say, really, is that I made a mistake for 3 years that a lot of people make. I believe that providing was the same as being valued. I believed that if I kept the support flowing, the relationship would eventually equalize, that Serena would come back to me out of love and not just necessity. I believed that being a good father meant being an available bank. What I know now is that the most loving thing I ever did for my daughter was to stop. Not to punish her, not to make a point, but because continuing would have made me a smaller and smaller version of myself, and a smaller version of me is not someone who could do her any good. A few months ago, Serena asked me if I would come to her house for Thanksgiving. She said it like a question, careful and real, not an obligation being discharged. I told her I would bring a pecan pie. She laughed, a real one, the kind she had when she was 9 years old and we used to stay up past her bedtime watching old movies that her mother pretended not to know about. I drove 40 minutes to the bakery. I sat at her table, taped past the rolls and said something that I didn't agree with, and I said so politely, and he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Not anger, not contempt, something closer to calculation, like he was refiling me under a different category. Good. That's exactly where I wanted to be. I am 63 years old. I built a career, raised a daughter, loved a woman for 28 years, and stayed by her side until the very last day. I know what it costs to love someone well. And I know now, more clearly than I ever have, that love without self-respect is not love at all. It is something else, something that looks like love from a distance and feels like disappearing up close. I drove home that Thanksgiving night with an empty pie dish and my dignity intact, and I want you to know that those two things mattered exactly equally to me. I keep thinking about that pecan pie sitting on the passenger seat of my truck. 40 minutes of driving for something she didn't want. That image stayed with me longer than the angry phone calls did. Longer than the 43 missed calls on a Sunday afternoon. It wasn't just a pie. It was 3 years of trying to purchase something that was never for sale. Here's what I've come to understand about what happened between Serena and me. The outcomes we get in life are not random. They follow from choices, and my choices had a logic to them even when I told myself they didn't. Every time I wrote a check without a conversation, I was teaching her something. I was teaching her that my presence in her life had a dollar amount attached to it, and that the transaction could go in one direction indefinitely. I don't say that to blame myself. I say it because it's true, and the truth of it is actually the only useful thing I've taken from those years. What I wish I had understood earlier, and this is the thing I'd want any father in a similar situation to hear, is that real integrity isn't just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest with yourself first. I knew something was wrong long before Thanksgiving. I saw the signs in the way she stopped asking about my life, in the way Tate talked over me at my own daughter's dinner table, in the way I kept quietly building a spreadsheet of everything I'd given while pretending the spreadsheet didn't mean what it meant. I had all the information. What I lacked was the willingness to act on it. That's not a financial failure. That's a failure of character, and it was mine. The willingness to act. To actually do the hard thing after you've recognized the hard truth. That's the piece most people skip. It's easier to write another check. It's easier to tell yourself things will equalize on their own, that love will eventually find its level. I know men my age who have spent a decade in that particular kind of waiting. I was close to becoming one of them. What stopped me wasn't courage exactly. It was that night in the kitchen, alone with a pie I hadn't planned to eat, when I finally got quiet enough to hear what I already knew. That's what I mean when I say clarity is a form of intelligence, not book intelligence, not the kind measured in degrees or income, the kind that comes from paying attention to your own life honestly, without the comfortable excuses. Serena needed me to stop not because stopping would punish her, but because continuing would have made me someone she couldn't actually look up to. You cannot teach your children to stand with dignity if you have spent years demonstrating that dignity is negotiable. The ending of this story is a good one. Thanksgiving at her table with a real conversation and an empty pie dish, I drove home. But I want to be careful not to make the ending the point. The point is the Tuesday morning I called Paul. The point is every ordinary moment of deciding to be honest with yourself before the crisis forces it. That's where the real story lives, in the small decisions that nobody sees, that accumulate quietly into the person you become. I am 63. I have enough years behind me to know that the things we do with integrity, even when they cost us, even when they look like loss, have a way of returning us to ourselves, not as a reward, just as the natural result of living straight. That's enough for me.